Okay, if Rebecca's ready, I think it's time for us to get started. There we go. And welcome to Warner Historical Society's final Zoom presentation on Warner during the railroad era. Okay, sorry. We'll start again. Welcome to Warner Historical Society's final Zoom presentation on Warner during the railroad era. This program is part of a multi-organization collaboration of the Muse Group entitled All Aboard! Economic, Social, and Environmental Change During New Hampshire's Railroad Era. The project explores the impact of the railroad on rural New Hampshire towns and Native American groups across the United States. Our goal is for people to look beyond the trains and stations to see the changes in society facilitated by the railroad. Our presentation this evening will explore how the development of the railroad went hand in hand with the development of tourism. We will focus on the hotels, boarding houses, and summer camps that sprang up around Warner's 7 railroad stations. Tourists initially spent weeks at a time in Warner. What forms of recreation were available? How did business owners attract tourists here? What types of tourists stayed here? How did the snow train era expand business opportunities even as passenger train travel was disappearing? The programs and exhibits of All Aboard are funded in part by a grant from New Hampshire Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. For information on more railroad programs and exhibits, see nhmuse.org. My name is Lynn Clark, and I'm the Executive Director of the Warner Historical Society, and our other speaker this evening is Rebecca Courser, who is the former Director of the Historical Society and whose research forms the nucleus of this talk. She's researched Warner history for years and years, and we've added onto it some nice postcards and some of the objects from the collection and some newspaper advertisements. So it should be a fun presentation this evening. We're going to leave you all muted until after we're done, and then we'll unmute you so you can all ask questions or share some stories. Okay. And if Rebecca's ready. Thank you for calling the Warner Historical Society or understanding how
Not able to hear Rebecca.
Hi, we were having some technical difficulty. Could you guys hear Rebecca?
No.
I didn't think so. I couldn't either. So she's going to work on that. I'm going to read about Ralph Pratt's painting. We'd like to begin our presentation by answering the question, what do you need to have a tourist industry? You need people with disposable income and leisure time, images and descriptions of things to see, relatively safe and comfortable lodging, a supply of good food, and adequate transportation systems. Let's look at the lodging and transportation available to travelers beginning in the 18th century so that we can see the impact railroads had later. This is a quote from On the Road North of Boston by Donna Bell and Jim Garvin.
I was going to watch this, but that's all right. That can wait.
Until the mid-19th century,
Yeah.
the tavern served the
Go ahead.
diverse needs of a society with few specialized institutions. It provided hospitality, food, and drink to neighbors as well as strangers. It provided shelter to the traveler and his animals in an age when distances seemed vast and when transportation was slow and hazardous. It provided a meeting place for the local electorate and for social organizations. On occasion, it substituted for the meeting house, the school, the courtroom, store, and hospital. Its yard doubled as military training field, sports arena, stockyard, and fairgrounds. By its very nature, the tavern was also a place of comfort, relaxation, and gossip, a home away from home, a place where people congregated at times of celebration or play. The tavern offered fellowship, enhanced by the bottle, the pipe, the shared and dog-eared newspaper, and the diverting spectacle of the passing world. The tavern was truly a public house, its door open to all. A house offering accommodation for man and beast remained an essential landmark every 3 or 4 miles along each major highway. One late historian recalled 22 taverns flourishing at one and the same time between Concord and the center village of Salisbury, a distance of 20 miles. Rebecca, we still can't hear you, so I'll continue. Warner couldn't come close to setting that record, however. We had several taverns in operation in our early history. Our first was a log cabin owned by Jacob Hoyt in 1766 in the lower village to entertain travelers. Hoyt also operated the potash lot to collect ashes. Settlers needed to clear forest land for crop production and burnt their excess wood, creating piles of ash. Ash was brought to a potash lot to be leached, creating lye used in soap production. For every 10 bushels of ashes, a man was entitled to a gill of West India rum as a gratuity. Many settlers in Warner liked their toddy and this arrangement. Later, the log cabin was replaced by a framed structure, and several men operated the tavern for several years before it was converted to a private home in 1835 by Dr. Samuel Brooks. Asa Petit married Mehitable Jewett on January 4th, 1774 in Hopkinton. Petit served in the American Revolution, returned to New Hampshire, and lived in Goffstown before moving to Warner. In 1785, Petit built the first framed house on Main Street, which served as the family's home and place of business. He received approval to operate a tavern and hall here from 1796 to 1801. He served as a petty juror at the Inferior Court of Common Pleas, a surveyor of highways, a surveyor of lumber, and measurer of cordwood. The family eventually moved to Canaan, New Hampshire, where he died on May 4th, 1825. Captain Joseph Smith converted the main floor to a private residence in 1811, but rented out the large hall on the second floor for public meetings and entertainment. Despite no longer owning the tavern, the second floor was always known as Patty's Hall. And this advertisement says, rare curiosities to be seen at Mr. Patty's Hall in Warner on Tuesday, January 29th, 1828. 2 mummies from Egypt. The public is respectfully informed that the proprietor has, at great expense, procured these wonderful preservations of the human body as specimens of the ancient and now lost art of embalming. He hopes that the learned and curious will be gratified in viewing them. They were taken from the catacombs at the ancient city of Thebes by permission of the Pasha of Egypt by an American gentleman and brought by him to Boston. Massachusetts artist Ethan Allen Greenwood was the owner of these curiosities. He probably was on a tavern tour in New Hampshire. Copies of these broadsides with the owner's name written at the top would have been posted in the taverns to announce the coming attraction. And let's see if we can get Rebecca unmuted.
Rebecca should be unmuted now.
She is.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's better? Okay. All right, so I got distracted, Lynn. Where did you leave off?
I left off at Lower Warner Village. Warner had several taverns at this time. Number 7.
Okay, okay, so you finished that.
No, you're on to that.
Okay. Okay. Warner had several other taverns at this time. The Captain John Kelly Stand, a tavern and store in the Lower Village, burned January 16, 1828. The George Tavern was later built near this site, and Warner Lodge number 35 of the Free and Accepted Masons met here. It all went up in flames in May 1849 and was not rebuilt. The lodge lost all their furniture, records, and regalia. Richard Straw operated a tavern which was located at Courser Farm on Schoodick Road. Another tavern in Warner was located on the road connecting Bradford and Henniker. It was built and operated by Joel Howell until the railroad reached Bradford in 1850. This premise was known for its spring dance floor on the second floor and is now the home of Bill and Sherry Gould.
Tourism became a pastime of wealthy Europeans in the late 18th century. Americans followed suit by the 1820s, reveling in the natural beauty of their new country. Historian John F. Sears contends that this tourism was integral to creating an American culture rooted in the land that differentiated us from Europe. In the 1820s, turnpikes and canals made travel a bit easier than it had been. Taking the grand tour of the Northeast from Niagara Falls to the Connecticut River Valley and the White Mountains in New Hampshire was a necessary undertaking for wealthy socialites. They had both the resources and leisure time necessary for extended travel. Warner was located on the stagecoach route from Concord, New Hampshire to Windsor, Vermont. Heavy freight wagons and coaches had plenty of taverns to stop at along this route. Traffic began to wane when the railroad was established in Warner and Bradford in 1849 to 1850.
The Davis Tavern was built by Captain Francis Davis in the 1770s from white oak timbers. The Davis family operated the saw and grist mills located at the falls behind the tavern. Captain Davis made the trip to Portsmouth, asking for the town's incorporation in September 1774. In the L, on the second floor, was a dance hall with a spring floor, an arched ceiling, and a musician's platform. African-American and Revolutionary War veteran Anthony Clark played his fiddle and taught dance classes here. Nathaniel Davis, the son of Davisville's leading citizens, Aquila Davis, embarked on a grand tour of his own in the early 19th century. He traveled by foot and horseback down south to New Orleans, then north again through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio. He was curious about his new country. He did not like all that he saw, however. Unlike many who were at the top of the social order, he perceived the plight of those outside of it. As related by Fernanda Harrington in Lost Davisville, Davis saw the injustice of Native American removal in the South, and especially the injustice of slavery. By the time he returned to Davisville in 1824, he was an abolitionist, and his house became a stop on the Underground Railroad. From taverns and turnpikes, we learned that clandestine activity along the New Hampshire highways also included the fugitive slave traffic. In the early 19th century, large numbers of slaves escaped from the South as stowaways aboard vessels bound for New England ports. Particularly after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, an informal network developed, headed by the Vigilance Committee of Boston and extending into New Hampshire, with the sole mission of assisting runaway slaves to safety in Canada. Often they were transported by night in teamsters' wagons concealed among the freight. The Tavern would supply temporary refuge, and a number in New Hampshire were known as stations on the Underground Railway.
The Bean family was instrumental in building and operating the mills at the Great Falls located down the hill from their home in Waterloo. The L was probably built in 1795 to 1797. With the increase in freight and coach traffic by the house, Daniel enlarged his house with a two-story addition to accommodate travelers. A journeyman stenciler painted a mural on the wall in the tap room. A small mash pot room with a well-preserved brick stove with an iron top and removable lids was used to heat mash for the horses, and a toddy box or cabinet for keeping bottled goods warm was located over the fireplace in what was probably the tap room. Notice the carriage sheds and large barns to stable animals and store tons of hay.
By the 1830s, lodging establishments were moving away from the tavern model toward the hotel. They were responding to tourists' increased expectations for comfort, as well as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants' demands for temperance. Taverns were associated with alcohol. Hotels in the early 19th century were dry. There was little privacy at taverns, with strangers sharing a room and even a bed, while the hotel had many separate bedrooms as well as specialized rooms such as ballrooms and parlors. Anthony Colby bought Dudley Bailey's home on Main Street in 1832. He converted it to a comfortable hotel to accommodate travelers. After his death in 1835, it was sold to Nathan Walker, who was engaged in the business of operating the stage route from Concord to Windsor. For the next few decades, the hotel had many business managers.
On Tuesday, January 10th, 1843, Mr. and Mrs. Reuben Clough were invited to a social ball at the Hall of Webster Davis. Dancing to begin at 5 p.m. and tickets $1.50.
A little later, Mr. Farron held the Washington Ball on February 22, 1850, probably in honor of George Washington's birthday. Dancing began a little later at 7 p.m. and tickets were still $1.50.
We stated earlier that tourism relies on images and descriptions of the scenic wonders that would lure tourists to an area. Paintings from the Hudson Valley and White Mountain schools of art acted as advertisements that spurred tourism. Increased tourism created demand for better transportation. The railroad answered that demand. By the mid-19th century, tourism spread along railroad lines to New Hampshire's coast, lakes regions, and even rural hill towns. Spectacular scenery and railroad access was not enough to attract tourists to a location. The scenery had to be accessible to the average person, and Warner's greatest attraction, Mount Kearsarge, was not. Warner businessman Nehemiah Ordway, pictured on the left, envisioned a way to capture tourists who would otherwise travel by train elsewhere for vacation. His vision called for a carriage road to the top of Mount Kearsarge with a grand hotel either at its summit or its base. Ordway proposed that the town share some of the cost of building the toll road, which he would then control. The proposal failed 3 times between 1866 and 1871, but with the backing of other prominent citizens, it finally passed. The road opened to great fanfare on July 4th, 1874. Shortly after, the old Walker Hotel was renamed the Warner and Kearsarge Mountain Hotel, and it became Warner's Grand Hotel.
Alonzo Carroll previously managed the Winslow Hotel located on the other side of the mountain. Ordway enticed him to move to Warner and manage his hotel. After a few years, Carroll turned over the hotel management to Mr. Hutchinson. Carroll leased Ordway's Union Block building and established a very productive mercantile and lumber business, which he was later managed by his son and his grandson.
The newly refurbished and renamed hotel advertised in Boston papers to entice summer visitors. Excursions to Kearsarge Mountain is proclaimed prominently in an August 1875 ad in the Boston Journal. The new carriage road to the top is also touted as where you can find the best views in New England. A new clientele is acknowledged in the ad as well, the middle class. Businessmen in Boston and vicinity can spend the Sabbath with their families in Warner and still be in the city during business hours each day. Vacation was as essential to middle class status in the mid-19th century as it had been earlier for the wealthy. Professionals would plan a month-long vacation, but even clerks, teachers, and shopkeepers could take off a week or two.
That month, the Boston Journal also continued a long and detailed description of Warner, Waterloo, and a trip up Mount Kearsarge. It was designed to entice the reader to visit with prose bordering on poetry. Just imagine having nothing to do, nothing expected of you, feeling it a duty to be lazy and performing that duty part of the time in a hammock swung under an old apple tree, where the birds sing and twitter and the bees hum, and the sunshine peeps through the foliage, and the breezes fan your cheek.
And it goes on from there. Unfortunately, disaster struck in the early morning hours of January 29, 1885, when hotel and Warner residents awoke to cries of fire. There were 25 hotel guests and employees who escaped without injuries, but they lost all of their possessions. A portion of the hotel was saved from the fire and moved across the street. Debris was removed and the foundation filled in.
Ordway decided to convert the building saved from the fire, which had served as space for storage and laundry facilities, into a smaller hotel to accommodate guests. He added dormer windows, piazzas on the first and second story, and 12 guest rooms.
Payne Davis and his family moved from Davisville to become the first proprietor of the hotel and manage the adjoining livery stable. Payne also served as Warner's postmaster. Payne is the man wearing a hat standing on the second story porch.
Camp meetings as summer resorts were an especially effective means of justifying expenditure of time and money on leisure. Something seen as wasteful is not sinful to earlier generations. The spiritualist camp at Blodgett's Landing on Lake Sunapee attracted tourists from all over New England, with excursions by train stopping in Warner. An article in the August 29, 1884 Kearsarge Independent reported that a large number of people traveled from Warner to the steamboats on the lake, which carried them to the camp and other points of interest.
We mentioned earlier that vacations from cities were viewed as good for the vacationer's spiritual and mental well-being. Beginning in the 1850s, children were removed from the immoral and unhealthy cities and sent to the countryside for their spiritual, moral, and mental well-being. It was believed that this could be achieved with fresh air, fresh food, exercise, and rustic living in bucolic scenery. Travel by train made the easy movement of groups of children from the city to the country possible. The earliest summer camps removed boys from the city and taught them many rustic skills. Girls regularly attended camp by the early 20th centuries, but their training was in more of the domestic skills. It was feared that poor and especially immigrant children were growing up without proper American culture and morality. The fresh air programs of the later 20th century have their roots in these 19th century programs. One such program, Country Week, was noted in the Kearsarge Independent on July 25, 1884, when they said, 11 poor children arrived on the afternoon train from Boston and were at once taken to the homes which had been thrown open to them for a week's vacation. They presented a very neat appearance and are enjoying country life to its utmost while they're here. The August 1st edition stated that the children returned, all evidently well pleased with their visit.
Dr. James Bartlett and his wife Caroline Gardner Bartlett purchased this farm on Horn Street in 1903. Dr. Bartlett was a dentist with a practice in Boston. Caroline was a voice teacher and a classically trained opera singer. Dr. Bartlett had a hall erected for summer concerts and dancing.
Cabins and outbuildings were constructed to house her singing school, Sunnyside, which operated from 1904 to 1909. Madam Bartlett is standing under the red arrow. Caroline and her students would perform concerts in the Warner and Bradford town halls and the Baptist and Congregational churches. Dr. Bartlett died on March 10, 1910, and Caroline brought him back to Warner to be buried on the property. Caroline went on to a colorful career in music, raised funds during World War I for a hospital she was directing in France, was accused of being a spy. He wasn't. Spent the rest of her life clearing her name, moved to the Austin Nursing Home in Webster, where she died penniless February 16, 1938. She was buried with her husband.
Martha West, a widow with 3 children, moved from Washington, D.C. to Newton, Massachusetts to manage a home for children of Baptist missionaries. Desiring a place in the country for the hot summer months, she arrived in 1910 at the Waterloo Depot with her children, a cook, 2 counselors, and 23 missionary children to rent this house on Willoughby Colby Road. Mother West is shown under the red arrow. The following year, Waterloo resident Senator William Chandler made a permanent home available by donating the use of the Eliezer Emerson homestead on Newmarket Road.
Work was accompanied by singing or reading aloud. The boys assisted local farmers with haying. Afternoons were spent swimming in the Warner River or playing baseball or croquet. Outings in the Minks and picnics on Mount Kearsarge were summer highlights.
It was said that Mother West had humor, wisdom, patience, and innate love for all of her family, and gave the children a firm foundation for educational and professional careers. Mother West operated the camp until her retirement in 1927. Camp Newton continued until 1933. Then Ingleside School in Revere, Massachusetts ran a summer camp for girls until 1944. The Margaret Fuller Settlement House utilized the camp for the next 15 years. A Mother West Memorial Fund was established with the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation to sponsor scholarships for young people to attend summer camp.
We returned to the former Asa Patee Tavern, which had been used as a private residence and doctor offices for Caleb Buswell and Leonard Eaton. The Eaton heirs formed the Eaton Company and leased the building as a hotel to various managers. A fire in 1905 destroyed the barn and accompanying stable and did some damage to the main structure. 2 months later, it opened under the name of the Cummings Hotel and was managed by Mrs. Lydia Cutting. In 1909, the Eaton Company sold the land to the town so they could build a new brick town hall. The frame of the hotel was used to construct a barn on Pumpkin Hill at the current home of Agnes Birkin family. And here's another photo of the Warner Hotel. And here it is being torn down.
In 1866, Arthur Thompson converted an old barn across from the main depot into a factory for the manufacture of corn brooms and brushes. The business did not prosper, so he leased the building in 1888 to Will Cressy, the future vaudevillian, to be used as a grain and feed store. After a year, Thompson took back the business, and Charles Adams managed the store until he went into the grain business with his father, Jacob Adams.
And here is a menu from 1899, because remember we said we needed lots of good food. So seeing the need for more accommodations, Thompson decided to add a sleeping ell to take in summer guests. And here's his extensive menu. featured several courses available on July 1st, 1899. Dinner being served from 6 to 8. You could choose from consomme or cream of chicken soup, baked bluefish, sirloin of beef or young turkey, ox tongue or ham, a variety of relishes, mashed potatoes, string beans, new beets, onions and cucumbers, chicken pie or macaroni with cheese, princess pudding, apple or lemon pie, jelly, chocolate and strawberry ice cream, angel cake, chocolate and spice cake, bananas, nuts, and raisins with some coffee or tea.
It was so successful, he printed a brochure with descriptions and photographs of Warner for the announcement of the summer season on June 4, 1900.
The following year, Thompson added a third floor, bathrooms, and electric lights to serve 75 guests. Later, a covered pavilion, golf course, lawn tennis court, croquet grounds, and boats for exploring the Warner River were added.
July 4th was celebrated in Warner with a long parade with floats, food, music, and a baseball game. This stagecoach in front of the inn was gaily decorated for the festivities.
The Warner River was located across the street and behind the main depot. Visitors could canoe or row up and down the Warner River from Ela's Mill to Lower Warner. A seasonal footbridge assisted people across the river to the ball field and saved walking up to Elbridge and down to the field.
The Kearsarge Independent remarked that a group from the Colonial Inn had climbed Kearsarge on July 29, 1904, and the following month, the guests enjoyed a hayrack ride to Kentucky on a Wednesday evening. Thompson operated his successful enterprise from 1900 to 1914. His wife, Caroline, died in 1912, and since Thompson was approaching the age of 70, he decided to sell the successful business to Harry Chesborough.
Prospect House opened February 11, 1896, under the management of S.T. Bailey. An ad described the premises as new, clean, pleasantly situated, and newly furnished with modern hotel conveniences. The tables and bed were first class and a good livery was connected. A carriage to and from all trains were free. According to the Kearsarge Independent, about 40 citizens attended the opening. After Arthur Thompson opened the Colonial Inn, he purchased this property, owned at the time by a Mr. Barton, to use for overflow accommodations for his summer boarders.
In 1905, Jacob and Harriet Adams purchased this property on Main Street for $1,500 and opened the Adams House. 4 years later, Henry and Myra Annis purchased the boarding house operation. This photograph shows the boarding house decorated for the July 4th parade.
In 1827, Blanche Trow was the proprietress and called the boarding house like home. The postcard reads, "A fine time in Concord, Manchester, and Warner."
Harry Chesborough had purchased the Colonial Inn from Thompson in 1914. He immediately printed a brochure to let the public know the inn was open under new management. The business would be open from June until October. He advertised about the number of hills that were available to climb, and all were in the 1,500 to 2,000 feet above sea level, with Mount Kearsarge at 2,943 feet. The hills included Torrey, Chandler, Bald, and Blueberry Mink, Pumpkin and Burn Hill, Mount Olympus, and Mount Pisgah. Harry managed the business until 1921, when he moved to Pembroke to open a poultry business. He sold the inn to Horace P. Tilden of Waltham, Massachusetts.
Senator William Chandler, a summer resident of Waterloo and friend of Nehemiah Ordway, purchased several of the rocky hillside farms in the Minks. His favorite spot was Monument Hill. Chandler created hiking and carriage trails and a picnic area for the general public. On September 25, 1909, a gala ceremony celebrated the erection of this tower. The views at the top afforded a 360-degree panorama of the surrounding hills and Mount Kearsarge. Walter Harriman, a local resident of Waterloo, requested the name of the hill to be officially recognized as Chandler Mink, which it carries today. The Chandler family donated the land Senator Chandler acquired to the town to be known as the Chandler Reservation.
Herbert and Mary Jane Bean had been operating the utility poultry farm at their home in Davisville. They decided to renovate the farmhouse and buildings to accommodate summer guests and called it the Glendon, the great commoner summer resort of New England, which signaled the vacations where everyone could reach.
This is a photo of Herbert and Mary Jane, and we love this because it's posed but informal, and he has his arm around her shoulders. It's very sweet.
Plus, it's a great hat. They remodeled the barn into a sleeping room and in 1912 built a dormitory of 24 additional sleeping rooms. At the time, the rates were $6 per week for a double and $7 for a single.
This brochure for the Glendon advertises a piano, ample grounds, abundant shade, free boats, elegant bathing, fine fishing, free carriage to the depot in Kentucky, pool rooms, half a mile of waterfront on the Amesbury River, which is the Warner River, excellent cuisine, milk, cream, fruit, vegetables, poultry, and eggs in abundance produced on the farm. Young people who wish to enjoy their vacation should try the Glendon.
This image shows guests in front of the rustic dance pavilion. The man in the front might be John Bean, Herbert and Mary Jane's son, who will take over the business and continue to make improvements.
This photograph includes the images of the dormitory. Later, a cement swimming pool was added behind the dorm.
This ad for summer guests mentions the Catholic Church in Kentucky. Guests from the Glendon raised money towards the installation of the stained glass windows at St. Teresa's. Guests often decided to get married at the inns they frequented and decided that they were their favorites. The Kearsarge Independent noted on September 5, 1930, Miss Helen Brooker of Jamaica Plains, Massachusetts, married another Glendon guest, Charles Spiegel Jr. of Roslindale, Mass. They were married by Justice of the Peace Arthur Huntoon.
The country corner store sold sundry goods, candy, cold drinks, and postcards. It supplied the needs of visitors to the various boarding houses located in Davisville for many years.
But the sender of this postcard lamented that they didn't sell booze.
Mrs. Elizabeth Martin purchased the Kearsarge Inn in 1914. She was a divorcee and moved to Warner with her 3 children. She ended up marrying one of her boarders, Charles Malchow from Brooklyn, New York. Elizabeth's daughter, Elsie Murphy, assisted in running the inn during the last few years.
The Martins brochure emphasized Warner's exceptional beauty and relaxation no matter what the season, while those seeking entertainment all seasons of the year would find it in abundance and variety. Trails are splendid for summer hikes and winter sports. The inn furnished fine beds, a good variety of home-cooked foods at attractive rates. Special weekly rates or party weekend rates are furnished on request. The Malchows have a few guests that actually live at the inn year-round. Charles was employed by the State Fish and Game and used his expertise in guiding guests on fishing and hunting trips throughout the year. And this looks like it was one of those exceptionally fine game trips.
Donna Brown, in her book, Inventing New England, points out that tourism helped turn the middle-class workers into consumers by the 1860s. A sense of frugalness was replaced by consumerism in the name of spiritual and mental well-being brought about by vacations. Tourists denied that the landscape was a commodity by romanticizing their relationship to it. However, aspects of tourism, monetary aspects of tourism are apparent. Tourists consumed railroad tickets, hotel rooms, sightseeing excursions, luggage, journals, guidebooks, and souvenirs. This is one of the souvenir china plates made in Germany with images of Warner points of interest, and we have them that show the Pillsbury Library, Mount Kearsarge, the Simons Free High School. And these were made in Germany, so World War I ended their manufacture as souvenir items here. We also have Abenaki baskets and a birch bark canoe, and items like these were sold at Blodgett's Landing in the late 19th century through the mid-20th century by Louis and Catherine Watso. And that's them at their stand in Newberry.
Boarding houses provided a less expensive option to hotels, further opening up vacationing and tourism to middle and working class people. Mason Fisher purchased the old Poor Farm from Frank Clark in 1899 and opened a guest home. Fisher advertised in the Tourist Guidebook of the state of New Hampshire in 1902. His ad says, "This house has a fine location on the pleasant eminence known as Burn Hill. The view from the broad piazza takes in the wooded Minks and glorious Kearsarge. 1.25 miles from station, telephone, and telegraph offices, churches, and post office. Rural delivery once a day. He charged his guests $1 per day or $5 to $6 per week and could accommodate 25 guests. He was open from June until October 1st. He was in business until 1915.
Marcia Stevens married Benjamin C. Flanders, and they renovated the Flanders family cape on Waldron Hill to accommodate summer boarders in 1899. In 1903, Benjamin enlarged the facility to include 10 more rooms and named it Mountain View, as the house commanded a sweeping vista of Mount Kearsarge.
Julia and Philip Putnam purchased the property in 1914 and continued the business. Their ad stressed a fine view, good food, and sanitary plumbing.
The Kearsarge Independent on February 9, 1923, reported the Mountain View House, a 96-acre farm with all livestock, tools, hay, and household goods, were sold by Mrs. Lulu Putnam to Pierre Hosley of New York City for a summer hotel. Mr. and Mrs. Hosley are natives of Switzerland and experienced in catering to the public. Mr. Hosley served in World War I. They will take possession in the spring, conduct general farming, and cater to summer guests. Hosley also purchased the farm at the top of Waldron Hill and renamed it Alpine Farm. He used the farm for his gardens and to raise his Jersey heifers for milk production. He added an addition to the back of the premises to include a kitchen and dining room and advertised Swiss-style meals and Alpine festivals. The Hosleys are the couple seated on the bench in the middle. They owned it until the 1960s. Harold and Marilyn Panton later operated it as Sky Island Inn. It is now in apartments under the same name.
Fred Chase purchased the Benjamin Davis farm on Pumpkin Hill in 1892 for $3,300. He added a 2-story piazza and first named it Pumpkin Blossom. He later changed the name to Pleasant View.
The Kearsarge Independent often listed tourists staying at the various boarding houses in Warner and what their activities were. One hot August day in 1904, Chase brought a party of 9 for an outing at Keezer Lake in Sutton.
Lynn found Pleasant View ads placed in the Boston Herald from 1895 through 1908. The ad for 1895 described the beautiful Pumpkin Blossom boarding house was located 2 miles from the main depot and to right for a circular. The 1908 ad described a beautiful location, a fine table, and everything fresh from the farm, fine walks and drives.
Fred Bean also advertised the Ingleton Farm in the 1902 Tourist Guidebook with this description: a 2-story farmhouse situated on high ground with plenty of shade and a good lawn. 5-minute walk from the station, post office, store, and churches. Price, $1 per day, $6 per week. Accommodates 12 guests. Open from July to October 1st.
Walter Sargent described his boarding house, Elm Farm, on Torrey Hill as accommodating 25 guests and being open from June to October also. His short description mentioned that the location is elevated, the scenery unsurpassed, some of the most picturesque drives to be found in central New Hampshire.
This colored photograph, taken in the field, depicts the Torrey Hill Schoolhouse with Mount Kearsarge in the background. Elm Farm was readily accessible for scenic drives up Mount Kearsarge and hikes in Kearsarge Gorge and on Quimby Road to Salisbury. This is currently the home of Kearsarge Meadows, operated by Kimberly and Georg Edelman.
Ed Clowes, a great-grandson of Oakman Weber and his first wife, shared his memories about the Amesbury. Ed's mother was Jeanette Callis Clowes, who lived with Oakman and Augusta while her mother Helen worked in Boston and came home on the weekends.
Oakman and his second wife, Augusta, owned and lived in the Amesbury, where Augusta ran a thriving boarding house in the summer, while Oakman managed the country corner store year-round. The Amesbury was full of guests in July and August, with a maximum of about 50 people, and overflow guests sometimes stayed on the second floor of the store.
It was popular for its dance pavilion on the river. One could boat and fish on the river, provided one went upstream around Gunner's Nose, as downstream led over the Davisville Falls. The Webers operated the business from the 1920s until 1941.
This image shows the back of the Amesbury from the river. Its size is very deceptive from the front as you look at the brick cake house.
Both of these ads were posted in the Boston Herald. The top ad was listed in 1925 and the bottom in 1941. The weekly rates had not increased much. By 1941, Augusta was emphasizing the recreational opportunities of tennis, horseshoes, and a recreation hall on site. A short distance away, meaning Pleasant Lake, one could dance, bowl, and bathe. She's probably referring to the Dustin Golf Course in Hopkinton. Notice the bus stop could drop passengers off on its way by in the 1940s.
The summer guests here are posing for a photo on the steps of the country corner store sometime in the early 1930s. Jeanette Callis Clowes is the young girl, second from the right.
In 1904, Mr. and Mrs. Homer Davis took summer boarders from the city. They called their place Riverside. Similar to the Glendon, they also added a second building for sleeping accommodations. It was the second house on the right after crossing the Warner River from the country corner store.
Here's a postcard of the Riverside, which says, "This is where we are staying. It is just lovely here. Would love to hear from you. Mrs. G.M. Lambert, in care of Homer Davis, Box 18.
Mrs. Fanny Shirtliff named her boarding house Sunnyside. Her husband, John, worked in the Davisville Mills, just down the street.
In 1898, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Sanborn bought this farm in Davisville and started taking summer boarders. They called it Hillcrest.
One of the 3 bricks houses in Davisville. This one was built for General Aquila Davis, who refused to live in it. He said, "It's too tight. He would die come spring." So he moved back to the Davis Tavern. However, Davis family members lived here until 1931. Edward Whiting of Cape Cod purchased it and opened the Candlelight Inn. 3 owners later, in 1948, George and Ellie Curtis ran it as the Flagstone Inn.
Mrs. Lambkins advertised the Iron Kettle in the Boston Herald in 1936. Come for rest or recreation, swimming, dancing, bowling near, which would be at the Pleasant Lake Casino. Gentile only. Right for booklet. The boarding house was located at the junctions of Route 103 and Iron Kettle Road. It got its name from a large cast iron kettle that stood on the lawn. It burned twice, the first time losing the barn and the second time the house. And there's the ad.
Having disposable income and leisure time did not guarantee that you would be welcome as a summer visitor. Lodging was segregated by class, ethnicity, race, and religions, and ads could be quite explicit, like this one. Anti-Semitism and racism could be coded. A brochure for the Mountain View Alpine House, which used the phrase selected clientele. Phrases like restricted or selected clientele were found by New York courts to violate civil rights laws, as it was understood to mean no Jews or blacks would be accommodated. In 1957, over half of the hotels in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire still banned Jews. Blacks and Jews were so regularly excluded from lodging that they published books specifying safe places to sleep and eat while traveling. The Negro Motorist Green Book, recently made famous by the movie The Green Book, had 2 listings in New Hampshire in the 1940s and the 1950s, one on the seacoast and one in the White Mountains.
Summer camps were segregated in the same way that hotels and boarding houses were. Camp Merrimack for Jewish boys opened in 1921 in nearby Kentucky. Girls were welcomed after World War II. It remained a Jewish camp into the 1950s, then a general camp after a change in ownership. It was sold to the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Boston in the 1990s. Heather Mitchell of the Hopkinton Historical Society shared a story with us about the camp and the Kentucky Depot. Ken Smart of Hopkinton, who worked for the railroad from 1947 to 1952, remembers the hectic summer months at the Kentucky Freight House. The summer months were the busiest as we dealt with the coming and going of the campers of Camp Merrimack and the additional summer boarders that came to town by train. It seemed like the freight house would be filled with trunks and duffel bags that had all to be weighed and tagged around July 1st and again at the end of August.
Mr. Dewey Coach purchased the Samuel Dow House in Bagley in 1946 and operated a guest house known as Wedgwood.
2 years later, he sold it to Mr. and Mrs. Richard Hines, who ran the guest house and opened an antique shop.
Frank and Emma Johnson decided to open a boarding house with their son Charles in 1912 on Collins Road. They added a large 2.5-story addition to the front of their cape to accommodate 20 guests. Rates were $2 a day and $7 to $10 per week, according to room and the number of occupants.
One of the selling points of their brochure was the availability of fresh vegetables, fruits, and milk provided from their herd of Ayrshire cattle. The Johnsons had 40 head of cattle, and milk was delivered to the Melvin Mills Depot, where it was picked up for D. Whiting and Sons and transported to Boston. A 30-minute walk brings one to Lake Massasecum, one of the most beautiful bodies of water in New Hampshire, where may be enjoyed bathing, boating, canoeing on both river and lake, and fishing for pickerel, bass, and perch.
Day trips can be taken by automobile to Mount Kearsarge, Sunapee Mountain, Mount Monadnock, Manchester, Concord, and many other cities and resorts. We have facilities for housing a few cars and do have automobiles for hire. The farm is connected with long distance and local telephone. One can be picked up at Melvin Mills Railroad Station. Charles married, can you go back one?
Sure.
Charles married Carrie Stafford in 1912, and unfortunately she passed away 1 year later. In 1914, Charles married Leela Young, and they continued to assist his parents operating the farm and boarding house. Then Charles became postmaster for Warner in 1916.
In 1917, Frank Johnson purchased the Maples on Main Street from Mrs. Sarah Watson, who had been operating a boarding house and had decided to retire. Within a few months, he sold it to his son, Charles. Eventually, Charles moved to Concord, where he had a successful banking career and served as mayor. In 1944, it was purchased by Mrs. Hicks, who changed the name to the Old New England Dining Room. It is currently the Maples Bed and Breakfast, owned and operated by Cheryl Johnson.
The original house, built by Philip Flanders about 1787, stood a few yards away from this present structure on Burnt Hill. Several years later, the small house was moved and the site considerably enlarged by local builder Daniel Floyd. Ruth Flanders, daughter of Philip, was born in this house. She married Reuben Clough Sr., who lived over the hill on Scudic Road. It has been said that Philip and Reuben swapped farms, thus exchanging the wind on Burn Hill for the water at Scudic Brook. 5 generations of Cloughs lived here: Reuben Sr., Jr., the third, Fred, and Elmer. It was probably Reuben and Mary Clark Clough III who began taking boarders in the 1870s.
Reuben placed an ad in the Boston Herald in 1872 which said, "Summer board can be obtained at a first-class farmhouse in Warner. For further particulars, inquire of Reuben Clough." The 1881 ad, 9 years later, described the boarding house as being pleasant and situated in a healthy location, beautiful scenery near Kearsarge Mountain. Actually, one can see Mount Kearsarge, the Minks, and a sweeping vista to the southeast towards Manchester.
Elmer and Eleanor Shirtliff Clough, who married in 1921, continued the boarding tradition. Eleanor had prior experience as her mother Fanny operated the boarding house Sunnyside in Davisville.
This postcard of the Burnt Hill Farm was written in July 1933 by Tom and Agnes to Jack, and it says, "This is where we are staying. It's a wonderful place."
In 1885, Charles and Ella Pratt, editors of the popular children's magazine Wide Awake, purchased this property on North Village Road to build a grand Victorian they named Maple Ridge. After their deaths, George Flanders and Dora Hodgman bought the property to operate a rest home.
George's son Hugh and wife Elizabeth, known as Lib Gillingham, purchased the property. Lib talked about their decision in an interview from the Warner Women's Oral History Project. "Right after we were married in 1930, we bought Maple Ridge. We thought it would be fun. I didn't know much about cooking, not enough to know to put salt in the potatoes. I hated housework. I was never going to cook, never going to do anything like that. I liked office work, but look where I landed."
I've had guests here every summer and some winters. I had 2 guests that first summer. When we finally got going, a peak would be 71 or 2. The bigger the crowd, the happier they were.
We had 2 cooks. Roxy Smith would work 5 days. Catherine Greenlaw would work 5 days, but they would stagger it. We had 4 waitresses, and then the girl next door came in on weekends. We had the same menu week after week. Sundays was the big turkey day. I guess we'd use 60 pounds of turkey. We had, of course, 2 vegetables, mashed potato, and for dessert there was always 2 kinds of cake and ice cream. Monday was boiled ham day, usually spinach to go with it and a yellow vegetable. We had mashed potato and, of course, raisin sauce. Tuesday was meatloaf. Wednesday was lamb. To think of those big legs of lamb, probably 4 roasting in the oven.
Maple Ridge sat on a knoll above Silver Lake. One couldn't swim in the lake because it was the water supply for the town.
So Hugh dammed up Silver Brook below the dam and poured a cement-lined swimming pool. The water was really cold, but it gave a place for staff and guests to intermingle after lunch.
Hugh also installed a tennis court for his guests and members of the public. They could use it as long as they agreed to help with the maintenance. For 30 years, Maple Ridge was famous for its hospitality, its delicious home-cooked meals, and of course, Hugh's dance band. Unfortunately, this grand home met its demise on January 12, 1991, in an early morning fire.
Maple Ridge had employed so many local people through the years and had entertained hundreds of guests that Tom Greenlaw, a former employee and board member of the Warner Historical Society, decided we should have a memorial service for the public. So they did. Tom wrote an article for the Concord Monitor, and they contracted past employees and guests to share their memories, either at the service or in writing to be read at the service. It was very inspirational.
Now we will head to Waterloo, where there were several boarding houses. We'll start with the Henley. Harold Henley, son of Michael and Clara Bean Henley, married Catherine Bean on December 9, 1922. Catherine's family operated the Glendon boarding house in Davisville, so Catherine brought plenty of work experience to the table. They decided to operate the Henley. She had a reputation of being an excellent cook. Harold managed the farm and served as town road agent. Catherine was active in several community organizations, served as town clerk, and was a member of the Warner Graded School Board. They had one son, Tom. After graduating from Simons, he worked for Walter Miner at the Kearsarge Insurance Agency and eventually purchased the business. His son, Jer, can be found in the office today. Harold and Catherine sold the business in 1943 and moved closer to town.
The Brizzolaris were the next owners, and they continued the boarding house operation under the name Bonnie Bray during the snow train era.
Mrs. Addie Workman ran this guest house and inn known as Pleasant View. It was the former home of Nehemiah and Nancy Ordway. At a later point, it was known as Red Towers for its red roofs.
Brook Gardens advertised itself as an ideal spot for the winter vacation, a honeymoon, or winter sports. They gave directions for arriving by car, bus, or trains. Trains would be met at the depot in Waterloo. Rates were $8 for single and $12 for a double, and they were open year-round. Brook Gardens is located well back from the street in a park-like setting with lovely pine trees, a broad lawn, evergreen shrubbery, a tumbling brook, and a miniature waterfall.
They described Warner as being nestled among the foothills of Mount Kearsarge, and it was a beautiful New Hampshire town with white houses, churches, stores, library, coffee shops, gift shops, and a new ski tow. Brook Gardens was one of the boarding houses that would accommodate winter clientele.
Tourism changed as automobiles replaced passenger train travel. Motels, gas stations, and roadside attractions sprang up along roadways. With the advent of automobiles and highways, Warner tourist attractions were just a day trip from the Boston area, which led to less demand for lodging. Gradually, gas stations became available from Davisville to Melvin Mills. Mr. F.A. Whitworth operated Rockside Cabins in Roby. He had a lunchroom and filling station, provided roomy cottages, and access to the Warner River for fishing and boating.
Fortunately for Warner, the snow train era arrived. It began slowly with the first snow train arriving January 11, 1931. Warner did not have a rope tow at that time. Skiers needed to herringbone up Breakneck, Torrey, or Pumpkin Hill for their swish downhill.
Jack Chandler developed his ski area with a 1,000-foot rope and warming hut in 1943. Business really took off after World War II ended, and the Warner Professional and Development Committee started soliciting Boston-based businesses to bring their employees for a winter outing. The following inns and boarding houses were open for the snow train era from 1944 to 1955.
Snow Witch Lodge was a slopeside boarding house. If you look back at the picture that we just saw of the downhill slope, Snow Witch Lodge would have been located on the left where the arrow is pointing. So you could just put on your skis, shush to the bottom, and buy your ticket.
Oscar Elmendorf may have first opened Christopher Lodge as he purchased the property in 1940. His brochure doesn't mention winter sports or skiing at that point. He advertises swimming, rowing, fishing, hiking, and climbing, golf, horseback riding, ping pong, horseshoes, and badminton. Oscar gives directions of how to arrive in Warner from Boston and New York by automobile, train, or bus.
Philip Flick was the next owner in 1949. He advertised in the fall there were harvest festivals, probably meaning the Fall Foliage Festival, and there was hunting for bear, deer, lynx, wildcat, and pheasants. In the winter, less than a mile would take one to the ski tow for skating, and winter carnivals dotted the area.
In 1945, new life was breathed into the old Colonial Inn when it was purchased by 4 young men who had summered at Warner's Maple Ridge. Fred Butler, Tom McGill, John Bluth, and George Powers, all from Boston, decided it was time to take advantage of the snow trains coming to Warner. They bought the inn for $1,500. The men made repairs, refurnished and refurbished, and gave their business the name Pleasant Valley Inn.
And here we have a photo of guests posing on the front porch during the snow train era.
The Glendon in Davisville became the Scandinavian during the snow train era.
Mrs. Howard Heinel was the proprietress.
In the 1940s, this lodging house was known as the Motor Inn and operated by F.A. Sibley. The house had been built by the Reddingtons, who operated the Hug factory for several decades. They spared no expense in incorporating fine woodwork and beautiful gardens with stone structures.
Mr. Sibley advertised he was a direct stop on the bus line. You could get the best chicken dinner for $1 or milk-fed chicken dinner with waffles for $1.25.
Who knew chicken and waffles was such an old thing?
I know.
We have to chuckle. He advertised views of the lake and river. He described the water held back by Reddington's Dam as the Motor Inn Lake. If so, it was the smallest lake in Warner.
Stony Brook Inn opened under new management of Don and Frances Bailey beginning in 1947. They sent potential guests a tongue-in-cheek pact with Old Man Winter to produce excellent conditions for skiing and winter sports at the flood-lit Warner Ski Tow and the Mount Sunapee chairlift. Both slopes were popular with guests of the inn. They would do their part by providing excellent accommodations with a heated room, hearty meals, and fireside parties.
Unfortunately, the inn was destroyed by fire of undetermined origin in the early morning of February 3rd, 1952. The family and 4 guests escaped without injury, but the inn was a total loss. Estimated damage was $20,000 to the building, built on a bank, 4 stories high in the rear, 2 stories in the front. The Baileys would not be rebuilt or returned to Warner.
Despite a couple of years of late snow, businesses and boarding houses flourished until the opening of Mount Sunapee in 1956. Businesses that had brought their employees to Warner for recreation slowed, then stopped, preferring larger resorts with more amenities. Snow train service to Warner came to an end after a 25-year history. Stripped of their clientele, many of the inns shut abruptly. America's love affair with the automobile meant fewer people using the train for travel. The passenger train service to Warner stopped November 4th, 1955, and the last freight was in 1961.
And that ended both the railroad era and the tourism era in Warner. I hope you enjoyed the program. We're going to open you up for questions now. I just want to say we're having a Torrey Hill author series online. The next one is July 25th, and it's Susan Ware, who'll be talking about women getting the right to vote.
Lynn, you could go down to the next slide.
Is that down there?
Yeah.
There it is. And Vern Heinrich, August 8th, and Rebecca and Eddie Rule, mother and daughter, August 22nd. Just email me or sign up online for a ticket and a link. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to unmute everybody and see if anybody has some questions or observations. And if you're not unmuted, you can unmute yourself, but I think I got you all.
I have a question, Lynn.
Okay.
This is Chris Hager. Great presentation, Rebecca and Lynn. Really interesting. Since I have an interest in the Melvin Mills part of Warner, you mentioned a place called the Johnson was near the train station there. Does that still exist, or where was that?
Chris, that was located up on Collins Road, and it burned in the 1930s. It would have been the next house on the left past Marilyn Johnson, the woman who has all the sheep.
Okay. And was that the only sort of hotel boarding house near the Melvin station?
No, there was a whole bunch more that I could have put in. We would have been here for probably
Okay.
another hour. So at the base of Bible Hill, the big house,
Yep.
that was a boarding house run by the Bagleys.
Bagley's, yeah, right.
And the Mosers had, Mrs. Mosier operated the depot. She was the postmistress. They also had a little store and a filling station.
So was the filling station, that was my other question, was that near the train station?
Was across the street. It's right at the beginning of Stagecoach Loop on the left. It's a green grassy area.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Great. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
I have not. I have heard of it. I've seen it on addresses, but I don't know where it is.
I can stop sharing and we can see everybody here. Here we go.
Well, that gal has clearly made a career out of Warner's.
And that's incredible, the number of boarding houses.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, well, actually, a couple of questions. One is, would you explain the differences between a hotel and a boarding house?
Well, I mean, the boarding house, you're actually more like in somebody's home instead of renting a room in a,
Oh, okay.
And you get a meal with it?
Yes.
Right.
Okay. So the boarding houses would be cheaper then, correct?
Yes.
In theory, yes.
Yeah. Not anymore necessarily, but back then.
And my other question is, these are pretty big hotels, some of them with 50 guests and that. And when was the advent of indoor plumbing? I mean, I just,
Good point.
That's a good question, Ruby. Warner did not have water system until like 1900. And then the sewer system was a few years after that. So there were outhouses.
So you'd have just herds of people going to the backyard in the winter? I mean, or did they have chamber pots or?
Oh,
what about?
I would say they had chamber pots.
And then what about bathing? Would there be bathtubs sort of down the hall, or?
I think Thompson. I think Arthur Thompson for the Colonial Inn advertises that he has indoor plumbing by 1904.
And before that, people didn't bathe every day.
Yeah, I suppose.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just kind of, it seems so luxurious in a way, but then I thought, geez, some definite.
Okay, Ruby, someone named Sarah McNeil has a question.
Yes, I have a question. I guess I put my letters all together there. I'm just curious, when there were so many boarding houses and hotels, was there a competition, or was there sort of you might call it the Better Business Bureau of that era, that they somehow tried to work together to help everybody, or was there a real competition?
Oh, I think during the snow train era, things were kind of helped coordinated with the Warner and Planning Development Committee, because they really wanted to encourage people to visit Warner. But earlier you see in the ads, people are really pushing home-cooked meals, beautiful views.
How close you were to the depot sometimes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Each place would have its own special things that it would do. And the clientele was pretty loyal, I understand. It seems like people would return year after year to the same place.
Right, that would make sense that they would probably do that. And of course, a good host would take them out on a little walk and show them or ride about in a carriage or whatever to show them the sights.
And you have to remember there was not rural electricity. Main Street
Oh,
got,
Jesus.
Main Street got electricity in 1900. I know on Scudic Road, we didn't get electricity till 1930. So you're also dealing with a lot of these boarding houses
There was a general store then.
not having electricity
But they didn't know they didn't have electricity.
until they
A whole
until they
different
went to the
thing.
city. Right.
Great presentation, by the way. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So one thing that we didn't stick in, which maybe I'll summarize really quickly here, because we were talking about people coming back over and over again, is that early on, especially summer residents and residents, it was kind of a almost an artificial distinction sometimes, because you had families like the Ordways and Nancy Sibley Wilkins and the Senator Chandler, who would spend part of the year somewhere else, like Washington, D.C., and then the rest of the, the summer months and here in Warner. So, they basically had two residences, and the papers would advertise, so-and-so is here to open their house. They owned homes here, and they were pretty integral to the community. Some of the names, you would recognize. The Beans, they would summer elsewhere and then open the winter elsewhere and come and open the Glendon in the summer. So some of these family names that you would recognize, they lived in two different places. So that distinction between who's a summer resident and who's just a resident is a little artificial at times.
Okay, I'll give you an example. If you look on Waterloo Street, I think it was Tom Henley who said there was the upper end of Waterloo, which was where the Harrimans, the Ordways, the Chandlers lived. And then there was the lower end of Waterloo, where the worker bees lived.
I think Hopkinton Village was like that too. Some of the big fancy houses were not open in the winter.
I would love to see a map where these things are written down. I was trying to follow everywhere and but I'm so curious about some of the places that I wasn't sure where they were.
We need to write a book.
Yeah.
Well, somebody did suggest, that's another thing I'll do. I'll send you all an evaluation fairly soon. And somebody did mention it after the first talk. We should put all these talks together in a book. So maybe we will. With maps.
I think about present day. I live in Henniker, so we have the Henniker Bed and Breakfast and the Colby Hill Inn and the Henniker Motel. I mean, there were a lot of inns and hotels and everything, whatever, boarding houses in those days. My word, compared to present. Like, what's in Warner right now? Where's something similar in Warner?
The Maples.
The Maples.
Yeah. So you got one. One.
Yeah. Well, and the nature of tourism changed when you got the automobile, because you could go further in a day, so you didn't have to stay put so much, and people wanted to see the country. They'd just get in their car and go. So you're staying places just for a couple nights or so, and then you're moving on, instead of coming and staying in one spot for the season.
In one spot, only Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the hotels and the motels, that's a thing. They'd be near the highways, so not right in downtown Warner.
Times change.
Yeah. Fun though. Fun to see.
Want to turn it off?
Yeah. Anyone else?
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Oh, it's very worthwhile.